All right. Test, test. It appears as though my setup is now registering my voice for this, so I'm hoping you all can hear me. And in the off chance that you can't, please let me know in the chat, which I can see off to the side. This poor laptop is chugging along. I'm gonna have to figure out a new setup for streaming soon. But please do shout out if you can hear me, and I'll go ahead and start to explain what exactly we're going over here. So unless I don't see any distressing chats crop up, I'll go right ahead. So it's been a good couple of weeks since we've last streamed or presented anything, and typically the plan was to go ahead and explain exactly how landscape has, what project is underway with landscape. We've covered notifications, I believe, as they were being designed. We covered collections, which are our sort of notion of how we'd like to evolve links as they're currently displayed. But one of the things that I think is nice to do, since it has been quite a while since we've actually sort of reintroduced the project, or even introduced it at all in these design streams, was to take a look at where we were a year ago or so, through this adapted presentation that a few of us had cobbled together at Tlon. So this doesn't involve any sort of the unnecessary details around how we're actually thinking about how these projects are unfolding, but this is really more about just looking at what has been worked on in the past, and basically how we ended up to where we are now in the present day landscape. So the way that this general presentation is, it's not very long, and I'm going to try to embellish each slide accordingly as I go along, which shouldn't take very long. And please, as I mentioned in the chat earlier, do be free to ask questions about landscape if you have them, if you are familiar with it, if you are not familiar with landscape, which is currently a client that is running urbit. Please just ask anything about either project if you have the questions. So with that, I'm just going to go right ahead and get into these slides, which I'm going to keep in this zoomed out form, given my OBS setup right now, which isn't really set up to make any large viewports, which is I'm just going to go ahead with what we have here, and that should be totally serviceable for the purposes of this this stream. So then, it's good to note that landscape has been in development for quite a while. It used to be called something other than landscape, and around this time, I think this is a sort of rough point that we established loosely as OS0, the very first approach at defining what exactly it would mean to take this thing that is urbit, the computer built from scratch, and turning it into something that could actually be usable or interesting, or something that anyone who actually uses a computer these days would actually be into. This was a really interesting time because there had been a lot of explorations as to what exactly would make an interesting user interface. And the actual sort of designs that went into this, not to mention the actual, what ended up being implemented, but the designs were fascinating. There were sort of explorations as to how we could take this idea of a tile-based desktop and make each of the modules a little bit more fun or interesting or sort of like toy-like in a way, where I believe there were some designs for pomodoros, timers of all sorts, clocks of all sorts, even ideas for how to generate small games using entropy that could be simply run from one desktop. And this bears mentioning because this still, in a sort of extended way, really forms the sort of conceptual underlay for where we are at now, which is something that is a bit more utilitarian, but still sort of exhibits this desire to have something that is very playful when you first encounter it. So this thing was called Modulo at the time, which I believe was a code name. And for those of you who were around approximately a year ago, you might be familiar with this screen. So you see here fundamentally that this thing was running in localhost. At the time I was running my own urbit locally, and running it accordingly, which was local. But you can see here that we have the sort of fundamentals that you might expect in any given social computer system or interface. You have this idea of a chat. You have the ability to look at a clock or time, which seems to be an important quality that people are interested in knowing. We had this notion of being able to see the weather based on your location. This very minimal writing application we called Publish, which sort of melded this idea of what writing was in a general note-taking application along with being able to share it out with people. So blog, basically. And then there was this example right here. I don't know if the OBS actually displays my mouse, but I'm hovering over this cool app, which was an example of just a basic DIY sort of tile, which I could write up as a developer relatively easily. Wasn't too crazy. Just to get into it a little bit more in more detail. So you can see here we have kind of the basic trappings of a user interface. There's a header, which has a little house. It allows you to go back to the screen that we just saw. We have Publish in its basic state here, which would allow you to see any subscriptions that you had. So other people out there with their urbits, if they had blogs that they were running, this would be the way that you would access that, is by subscribing through it. But here we have anything recent, which I think at the time was recent in terms of what my subscriptions were. So I had this idea of being able to write my own posts or write my own notebooks, but also subscriptions would all occur in one interface. So the idea was that you could sort of just see the landscape of various posts that were made. It's almost a bit of a primitive RSS or blogosphere, really, just a way of seeing other people's works. This is chat. Again, this is super exciting stuff. It's what you'd expect. It's chat. You'd have the chat stream. You'd have a list of channels, and you'd have some ability to see the members who are a part of the chats that you're associated with. So nothing too crazy. So this is a really funny screen. This is a screenshot taken from an agenda that was written, and this just had some team members at the time, some key outcomes for what we were working on, just typical business stuff. And of course, this tongue-in-cheek mention to drop copious acid in order to imagine what was after Modulo, what was after OS1. So this was a really fun time. This was around late August, or like August or so, late 2019 is what I mean to say. And we took a really established period of time, a week or so, I believe, to think about this thing that we had in our hands right now, which I can flip back to. The goal for this was really to think about what this interface was, sort of what was the major architecture that defined it, its edges, its limits, etc., and what we really wanted to lean into in the coming year, 2020 that is. So at the heart of this, and I'll flip back to this, one of the things that I think was sort of most interesting at this time was that there were several documents that were just sort of shared around to really demonstrate or discuss in sort of an RFC-like manner what exactly was this interface that we wanted to build and have people experience and have people inhabit as a world unto itself. And one of the core documents that was revolving around this time was this document, Cities, was the name of it, written by Galen. And the idea for this document was to kind of pen out this much more zoomed out version of what interfaces could be. I think for those of us who do sort of live day to day in the sort of corporate wasteland that is all of the major application gardens out there, and just how it is to inhabit them with everything being very distinct, one of the things that I think we were really leaning into as a general thesis as a team was this idea that rather than having the actual application or the sort of modality of an application's limits really define what a community was, in the sense that when I walk into Twitter, I'm inhabiting first and foremost a world of Twitter. I'm not necessarily inhabiting a world where my friends are, or where my family posts, or where my team members live. We wanted to sort of flip that on its head in terms of an approach, and this document Cities really went in detail, really, along with all of our own sort of individual contributions, just on how to really think about how an interface could be sort of people first, in a very literal way. where it's me looking at the group that is my immediate group of friends and being like, hey, what are the sort of things you want to draw into us? What are the interfaces that we want to use? What are the sort of affordances that we want to make use of amongst ourselves? And this really, I think, forms a sort of conceptual seed that was what landscape is growing towards, and sort of how we are thinking about the way that we're designing this thing right now. So that whole sprint happened in August. There's obviously that was the end of the year, so a lot of projects were still wrapping up. I think we were still doing a lot of heavy development on Bridge and Azimuth and all those interfaces. For those of you who do use urbit, I'm sure you're familiar with that, but for those of you who aren't, Bridge was sort of the identity management system that deals with how you actually view the contents of what your identity is able to access through urbit in a bit of a shorthand. So I feel like a lot of work was going on in that realm, and OS 0 at the time, or Module at the time, didn't really have the team that is currently working on Landscape working on it. It was almost like the project of like 2 people, one of our designers and maybe one of our developers at the time, but it was very minimal. So this is OS 1. This is when we start to get serious about this thing and developing this thing in a little bit more of a manner that was indicative of what do we imagine real, actually used software to feel like. So early 2021, I feel like a good chunk of people who may be watching or who may end up seeing this might remember the sort of large release that we had around OS 1. Everybody, say hello to this thing. This is Landscape. But at the time, it wasn't called Landscape still, although this was the name that we were using internally just to talk about this thing as a project and as an overall vision, the software, that is. OS 1 was what we saw as being the first actually usable, in the sense that it was something that you could maybe deploy to a group of people who were relatively technically inclined and say, hey, install the binary on a remote server or on your own machine and pop this thing open in localhost and check it out. And so what you can see here is really conceptually very aligned with how Module presented itself, in the sense that we were still, in classic modular sense, really interested in how we could take piecemeal functionality and arrange it on screen in a very friendly way. That was kind of self-evident to use. You can see here that we still retained our clock with a very fancy new styling. We were able to surface up Dojo, which was our name for what is effectively the terminal application that Urbit was initially accessed through. And we have these modules that represent the sort of initial idea of what contacts or groups of people on Urbit could be, which we called contacts. Messaging, as we saw before, was just basic chat, and it still was at the time. We had links, weather again, and then publish again. Nothing too crazy or too new. I think what bears mentioning, though, is that this was around the time when we began to take the approach of making what we were building much more component-based, making it much more replicable, and treating this thing as though it was a serious software project, which shouldn't be news for many people who do modern sort of web development. But what we were really interested in was taking a lot of our ideals that were highly situated in sort of Urbit land, in the form of Hoon, thinking of things functionally and as deterministic interfaces, and trying to sort of evoke this in the interface itself. So in comparison to the previous chat, this was all sort of still at this time individually written pages of HTML, I believe. These were just like very hand-copied templates that we were using, but we were moving towards this goal of making things much more modular, having the thing really feel like a computer or sort of computing environment in and of itself, and not just a page that you would visit on the internet. So this is chat, or I should say publish, with some minimal formatting that was now made available to it. And this is when we began to first start using this very sort of normal baseline method of arranging interfaces that are social, and we began to establish this sidebar component, as you can see here, that we began to use in the majority of these interfaces that you still see today. So this is publish, this is chat, along with some of the initial scratches at what would later turn into Indigo, our design system that we use at Tlon, and just using other things, such as newly, at the time, publicized sort of sigil library that allows us to render sigils very nicely in a sort of application-based format. So that is chat. And I believe those are the only two screens that I had indicative of this movement. Because just a couple months ago, we sort of hit this much more interesting landmark in Landscape's development, which was OS 1.5, as we were terming it. And so this is Landscape, as I think you all who have been recently using Urbit are very familiar with. This is all sort of occurring in sort of that hazy bubble of late 2020. And I think what this marks the transition of was this us taking very seriously this idea of what groups meant to inhabit on Urbit, or on Landscape, I should say. So as a sort of point of reference here, I feel like for those of you who do recall OS 1's release, this was the sort of first time in which we decided to really make it known what the idea of a group was, or this thing that could represent like a bundling of people using Urbit computers. So at this time, I think the way that we had designed it, or the way that we had treated it, that I kind of bear some responsibility for, was this idea of treating groups as though they were sort of a management or sort of like settings-based interface, when in fact groups, as we sort of were always writing about them and talking about them, were this much more front and center thing. And so you can see here that contacts, which was in fact the sort of group structure, was something that we sort of just sort of waved along as just another module that you could access, when in fact this thing, as we had been talking about it for the longest time, was central. Groups were the thing. And so the major sort of turning point for this was 1.5, in which we began to really surface up this idea of having groups be the very first thing that you encounter. So the way that I recall describing this to some people was taking an iPhone or an Android phone, opening it up, and the first thing you see is utility. The first thing you see is functionality. And I think that one of the things that we were really beginning to take a little bit more seriously was this inversion of that fact, where I don't access some arbitrarily defined realm of utility to reach my friends. I reach my friends and sort of cobble together sets of utility around what our needs were. And so you can see here that a lot of the sort of landmarks that began to define our take at what Landscape could be are still manifest. You know, we still have our lovely clock. We still have the ability to access your Landscape through a more sort of classic terminal-based interface. And we have weather, of course, and a couple of other additions that are still being juggled around right now, but really what we're thinking about is how to make one's identity that much more sort of front and center. This thing is your computer. This thing is you and your friend's computer collectively, and we really want to give that its sort of due diligence in terms of how these things are treated in the interface. But, you know, the big thing here that I just sort of talked around was really the inclusion of groups as sort of the very first thing that you see when you access your Urbit. You can see these various, whether they're teams, in the example of Tlon. Tlon had been using Landscape to actually do business and to chat about work in a sort of very real way. And, you know, you can see things like other communities that propped up, such as a community around programming.files, or this community or group around a collective that was all distributed around a single star, which is a networking node in Urbit's terminology. So each of these groups really had their sort of means of being able to just inhabit the interface space itself. And this thing became, as of 1.5, that much more serious of a sort of people or groups or community assembling computer in a way. So some updates to the way that we began to think about our interfaces as well began to unfold, in which, as you can see here in this example, we have this group, as I mentioned, which you would see on your home screen, is now the interface. What you see before you is the sort of surface area of this group, Urbit index. And while it's only inhabiting one channel at this moment, which is a notebook, and this sort of new presentation of a notebook, which now allows us the ability to actually view things like images and sort of style writing as you would expect to in any other sort of normal application, you have this sort of presence, and this is sort of what Urbit index is, and this is what it has chosen to be. And while this is a minimal example of what a group surface area could be at this present time, we do have groups that have sort of occupied our interfaces in much more of a rich way. One of the sort of most obvious examples of this is our sort of hub for community activity and growth at the moment, which is Urbit Community. And so you can see here in the design channel, just some chats, images can be posted, and design chat is just but one channel of a variety of other channels. Some of them including other chats, some of them including notebooks, and some of them including collections, which are means by which you can share links with people and richly display them. So this is a really interesting point in time because we have realized that there's a sort of solidity to this model in the sense that groups as a sort of organizing mechanism are this really powerful thing. Rather than sort of accessing a network or accessing a computer or accessing a browser even and having to sort of navigate to some arbitrarily defined realm of networking, a URL is just a sort of like shim over just a bunch of IP addresses. We really thought that one of the more powerful ideas of what Urbit as a sort of core concept represents is that one's computer is one's identity. They're sort of this singular thing. And in that way, it's almost like a body. It's almost like this is my digital self and my digital selves and the digital others that I belong with and that I sort of interact with day to day. And something that we're beginning to explore much more seriously is how we can begin to really delve into what it could mean to have a means of accessing a computer that is really about this model of like what a person and a computer tightly intertwined could be. So that's kind of the state at which we had left in terms of this presentation. And I'm not going to really get into actual interfaces or plans that we are thinking about or plans that we plan on executing in the near term, because that wouldn't really be worth talking about in a free-form manner. But one of the things that I'm happy to go into and answer questions about, if anyone would like to answer questions in the chat or ask questions, is what are the sort of general realms of interest that we have at Tlon in terms of extending this thing, this model of a computer or a computer interface, making it much more rich or much more evocative, I think, in terms of these core ideals that we've been exploring throughout this thing's growth. So this is a boring one. This is a little bit more of one that is kind of more aligned with how one actually gets into software, which isn't exactly evocative of the beauty of a computer's architecture. But when we talk about how people first encounter landscape, I think specifically, but in a more extended sense, Urbit, I think one of the things that we've been really interested in is just how we take this idea of an Urbit ID, which is this sort of bit of identity. It's like a cryptographic identity. And how do we make it such that this thing is, rather than being like this sort of clumsy object that you wield, which a lot of people who are familiar with crypto and P2P software are very familiar with, it's how do we take this thing that could be clumsy, which is this notion of an identity that is very secure and is owned by an individual, and how do we make this thing sort of subsumed in the interface, or how do we sort of make it incidental to what it is to experience the interface itself? And this is interesting. This is actually a very deeply interesting problem, because when you think of a car and one's ownership of a car or of a vehicle, you don't think of the key as being that sort of like core thing that links you and this vehicle, this thing that allows you to go really fast wherever you want. You think of the thing, you think of the car, the vehicle. And in a similar manner, I think far too many platforms really do focus on this object that is one's cryptographic identity. And in this car metaphor, that might be seen as the key that allows you to access the vehicle. A lot of weight is really levied on this thing, when I think intuitively people don't really care about the key. It's like I said, it's incidental. I exist as like a person, and I want to go really, really fast. So I want the car. I don't want the key. And it's obvious that the two things are very tightly intertwined with one another. As a structure, you need a means of access to go really fast. But I think one of the things that we are thinking really deeply about in our work with landscape, but in a more extended sense, Urbit, is really how we could take this thing that is identity and possibly make it just a given. That the identity really is sort of like the representation of possibly one's computer, which is a special thing. It's something that lets you talk to other people, access information, and all that good stuff. But we don't want to think about this thing as like a wallet. I think that there's a sort of over-reliance or leaning on cryptographic sort of tropes that have been sort of bandied about, where it's like, oh, I have my tokens inside of my wallet that I access using my seed phrase, and nobody knows what the hell any of these things are. No one really cares about what those things are. They care about what's at the end of the thing. You want to use a computer. You don't want to use a seed phrase to access a wallet to plug into some web framework out there. You want a very concrete thing that you can actually do things with. And I think that that's something that we really emphasize in a lot of the work that we're thinking about, especially in the future. The next obvious thing, and sort of bit of architectural evolution we're really deeply interested in, is this notion of groups and what groups actually are, and how groups could possibly evolve into something way more evocative and way more fun than how one thinks of groups when you think of your sort of workaday software that exists now. For those of you who tuned into our last stream, one of our designers leading the efforts on notifications and sort of like a lot of other projects that are going on was able to showcase some of this idea of what sort of our leap mechanism, which is our ability to kind of jump around the interface, how this could form this really solid metaphor around navigation in a sort of broader context in what landscape is representing. And as sort of one line of inquiry, this notion of having groups be a way more solid mechanism of accessing groups is a very powerful idea. But there are a lot of other ideas as to how we could construe this notion of what a group is, or how a group could be represented. I think a lot of people in sort of crypto space are sort of aware of this idea of a DAO, or a DAO, a distributed autonomous organization. And there are a lot of interesting ideas in what one of these are, in that a DAO is as defined currently capable of doing anything anything money can do, really, a DAO can do, which is a very sort of, it's free, it's loose, but there's still a sort of like question mark there in terms of what the thing is actually capable of. And right now I think many people are trying to answer that question. And to sort of link this notion of sort of what the point of a given structure is to what I was previously mentioning in terms of onboarding, people really care about what a thing is actually capable of at the end of the day. A DAO, while it is sort of rich in possibility, it's kind of an aimless thing. You can add money to it, you can vote on how money is used, you can do things with that money, but what do I do with it at the end of the day? Like, what can I do with it? Anything? That's really hard to wrap my mind around. I find, as any sort of software designer might find, that people have a really hard time dealing with infinite capability or infinite possibility. So one of the sort of more important jobs that I feel we have in the near future is to really think about what this structure that is a group is, and how it could be made to do very, very highly useful things, highly fun things that people can actually wrap their minds around and be able to conceptualize at the end of the day. This is just a realm of development that I know that we're all really thinking pretty far in the future about, and excited to further develop this with respect to everything that we've shown. So just to hop to this now, just as a sort of point of reference, we see here before us what you would encounter when you open up a fresh new urbit today. You'd see some modules, you'd see some units of functionality, and you would see communities and groups and organizations of people. But it's worth asking ourselves, what is the sort of more maximally interesting version of this? And what could it mean to have a computer that really does revolve around and treat this unit of organization that is a group of people as sort of one of its highest modes of organization? So the last thing that I'd like to cover as just a sort of bit of thinking on where we're interested and where we're headed in terms of our thinking and expressing what landscape is and developing it accordingly, is this idea of an identity, which I sort of lambasted in the first segment of onboarding, which is that, of course, cryptographic identity is a very hard thing to do. But if we sort of jettison that and just think about what it is when you talk about what self-representation is in a sort of digital environment, this gets quite wild. There are so many different ways of expressing oneself online, of inhabiting a digital space, of sort of reconfiguring what you are able to do in accordance with what you want to do in a digital space. And this idea of what an identity is something that we haven't really gone too deep into in the current landscape interface, which is to say that if I were to go and hop on over to landscape right now, hop on over to my own urbit, I have this little thing that represents me in the corner. And when I click into it, I have more or less a pretty basic form on being able to say, hey, this is what I want this color to be. This is how I want to express myself. This is my name that I want to make known to the network, my email, and just a couple of other really basic things. It's not all too comprehensive. It's extraordinarily basic as it's expressed now. And even in the sort of realm of a community, I have my community, in this case is Urbit community. I click here, I can check out my own group profile, and I can modify it accordingly. So I can go to a group and I can say, hey, instead of being known as Ed here, I want to be known as, Hooner, or like Hoon Initiate 420 or something. It's like I can express my identity to the extent that I want to, which is nice. It's kind of like it's table stakes, it's baseline. I think one of the interesting things to consider is, right now the sort of single player story of landscape isn't exactly fleshed out, as I just demonstrated. There really isn't a notion of an endpoint or a place I can go where it's like, hey, welcome to my house on the internet, on the Urbit internet. This is what you can do. You can hang out, you can like throw a picture onto my cork board, or whatever. You can listen to some music, for those of you who remember MySpace. But that doesn't exist right now, and for good reason. As I had sort of mentioned a couple of slides ago, the way that we think about landscape is that it's this, it's not exactly like a totally free-form, open-ended, sort of infinite edges operating system yet. Although, everybody at Tlon, a lot of people in the community would say that that is our end goal. That's where we want to get to. What we have here in landscape is this really specifically tuned application for assembling communities. And we take that seriously. A community is a very richly interpreted thing, and it could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so rather than saying, hey, this thing is just a basic chat, or hey, this thing is a basic link list, we want to be providing a lot of possibilities for how one can assemble a group. Because a group or a community or a team, they do widely different things, obviously. And this has all sort of taken this idea of what an individual is and sort of pushed it to the side, This isn't a single player application, really. It's for people. It's for groups of people. And one of the things come 2021 that we would like to get a little bit deeper into is this thinking of, well, it is important if we claim this thing to be your computer or an environment that is of your individual cryptographically owned sovereign computer to really be able to surface up that expression of what you are and what you're all about in the interface itself. And so this is something that we've already been thinking about. This is something that we had, as a sort of team, a design team at the very least, been sort of sketching around many months ago, where when we asked the question, well, how do you discover what a group is, or where a group is, or what groups exist on the network? There really is no solve for that. But you can imagine a world where it's like, hey, the very first group that I see as a newcomer to landscape, to Urbit, is this sort of noob zone. It's Urbit community. And it's a nice place. It's very pleasant. It's very wholesome. And people just chat there, mostly about Urbit. Of course, it goes without saying. But it makes you wonder, well, if you're on Noob Island and you see a cool-looking individual up there, how do you know they're cool? How do they manage to effuse this sense of personality where it's like, oh, I recognize that you're like a closure hacker, and you're wearing that badge proudly, and I want to join whatever group it is that's associated with that badge. Of closure lovers, which is the programming language for anyone who's confused what I'm talking about. It's like, hey, how would you identify anyone? Right now you can't, but it's worth thinking about how maybe in the future, people who occupy Urbit community or have occupied it for a while may be able to display somehow their affiliations or their associations with whatever groups they deem themselves wanting to be interested in publicly representing, and be able to have people discover other nodes of the Urbit universe that way, very naturally, from person to person. And this is all a sort of realm of exploration that we're really excited about. I'm trying to think. I ended my own thinking a little bit abruptly there, but these are just 3 sort of sections. This is the end of the presentation that I had. There really wasn't much else to share out with everyone. And what I was hoping was that this video, this stream could basically serve as a nice little landmark for anyone who is new to this project, or who hasn't encountered it before, or is asking themselves, well, what is this thing anyways? Is it this like esoteric, hard to understand new language, random developer like fever dream project, or is this thing real? And I think for a lot of people who do use the network now, this thing is very, very concretely real. This is something that people inhabit. This is something that people use day to day. And it's worth mentioning that this project is in fact very real and is only getting more real. And this really is just to go ahead and show, what this brief history of this project was, where it came from, conceptually speaking, in terms of its design, and where we'd like to see it going eventually at some point. So, yeah, I'm navigating to Urbit now, and I'm in it. For anyone who does have questions, you can reach out to me in Urbit at Fabledfaster or Fabledfaster, however that's actually pronounced. And you can reach out to email. I might just paste that into the chat once this is done and over with. But if anyone has any questions, please let me know. I'll be playing a little bit of music right now with my mic still on and just back scrolling just to see if anyone has answered or asked anything interesting. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Let's see. All right. Yes, the track list will be dropped eventually. Not right now, though. That always takes a while to cobble together. Well, it looks like there are no questions, but I think until the top of the hour, I'll just be streaming music, just existing here. Maybe just kind of bouncing around Urbit for anyone who has arrived at this thing late or has any questions. Just please continue to ask them in the chat or on Urbit, and I'm happy to provide answers to whatever ability I can. Oh yeah. Hopefully this is useful for people in retrospect. Intro-wise, it would be good to revisit this or share this out with anyone who is asking, like, what is this thing even, or is this project even real? So, yeah, that's the hope for this. We're hoping to, by the way, stream a little bit more regularly every Thursday at around the same time. This is just the first of many. Just hoping to make it into much more of a regular sort of thing that we do. OBS is actually destroying my computer. I just realized the music wasn't on. Oops. Let's see. It looks like a message was retracted. Feel free to ask whatever. I should fix these levels right now. OBS is totally destroying my computer. Oh, cool. Here's a question. On the topic of identity and profiles on Urbit, I see right now on the GitHub project you all are working on simplifying the profile UX. How are you thinking this is going to work towards that focus on identity in the short term and long term? That's a good question. Yeah. This question does make sense. Let me make sure this music is actually lowered. On the OBS front, it looks like it's pretty low-key, but I can't hear it. Yeah, so just to answer this question, it's probably good just to kind of revisit what exactly a profile is to begin with. You know, for those of you who do use Urbit, you know, you log in with this thing that we call a pat-p, which is just the technical name for what the string represents, which is an Urbit computer's address or its name in the system. These are all kind of like one and the same thing. In this case, the way that we sort of treat identity is that this thing is simply a login. You know, you have a key, which is effectively a private key that you never share to anyone else. It's totally memorizable, actually. It was designed to be a very memorable sort of language that it's written in. And yeah, that's kind of sort of technically what you encounter. So if I were to like log out of this Urbit or sort of disconnect it, I would have to log in using that name, as I mentioned, and its associated key. So it's simple. It's basically just a pre-built username of sorts and a pre-built key. These things that you can, of course, you know, reset over time, but that's kind of a technical detail. So as I mentioned, you know, you use this thing to access Landscape, which is a client. We need to make it very clear that Landscape is not Urbit the computer. It's kind of just a user available interface for doing things using Urbit. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, we kind of treat identity as like a setting sort of component. You know, this is just a thing you can set. You know, I could set an avatar, I could set the sigil color, I could set these very basic things, and these are basically what I could use to be a little bit more human memorable in the system. One of the sort of ongoing sort of UX issues that we do sort of run into is how to sort of mitigate this idea of a very groups or community forward interface, where we do have these things that are individual groups. You can check out books, and this is all really about the book. You know, this is that thing. As I mentioned earlier, you know, there isn't that strong of a single player story at the moment, and basically we sort of direct everything that is sort of DM level or sort of individual user level, things that aren't sort of used as groups. We kind of all divert them into this one groups-like tile that we call DMs and drafts right now. So this is a bit of a disjointed experience because you can imagine, you know, if I'm inside of a group, like let's say if I'm inside of PalDev group, and I want to DM someone or message them natively, sort of like within this group, where it's like, oh yeah, you know, you would expect private communications to happen in the context of a group. Right now, they're kind of just, that's not a structure that we afford for. They're kind of their own thing. Something I can just kind of navigate to using the sleep interface right away. I think one of the things to consider is that in the future, the way that we sort of treat identity and sort of restructure it to be a much more strong pillar of what using Landscape is to probably also rethink how we treat DMs as well, or these things that are sort of DM-like in nature, where you know, we use the titling DMs and drafts because it's kind of easy to conceptualize. You know, you look at it and you understand immediately what's going on. But what's also contained within DMs and drafts is you know, notebooks that I, you know, maybe made for myself for private notes, collections even. In the future, when we offer, you know, a multitude of different channel types, it would be kind of weird to continue to call these individual units of functionality DMs or drafts. So it goes without saying that as we begin to sort of hone exactly what an identity is or what it serves to represent, we'll have to probably think about how to sort of tie a little bit more closely to that, restructuring what it means to sort of have a sort of self-owned unit of functionality in Landscape. And, you know, this is all a little bit abstract because, to be quite frank, this is still kind of a realm of exploration. We still don't really we still really haven't landed on, a very highly usable, aesthetic, very nice feeling way to sort of tie these two things together. And I think that maybe goes to answer a little bit of this question, which I'm rereading really quickly. Simplifying the profile UX. Yeah, I mean, right now it's kind of simple in the sense that it's just an extension of settings, but so simplicity might not be the best way to really talk about exactly what really needs to happen here. I think it really needs to be just like taking this thing that is identity and just sort of like decoupling it formally from what we're kind of talking about as settings here, because settings are quite a bit more broad than what a user profile is, and really maybe giving this thing its own due diligence, where if we envision sort of landscape to be an environment that you operate in, maybe what we think of as one's identity is like a personal communicator in that greater environment, or in the sort of realm of other applications that exist out there. With identity, maybe we can envision this thing as a sort of profile, like an endpoint that other people can visit at any sort of arbitrary time. That could be another way of explaining how we could go about refactoring this or making it a little bit more simple for people to grok. This goes, this kind of brings up a point where using urbit in a command line, something that you can immediately do in kind of classic P2P sense, is directly connect with a node as long as it's online, and that's called hiing someone. So what I could do here, I could actually demonstrate this right now, where if I type in terminal and just go to the terminal, it'll take a moment to connect. But something that I can't actually do actively right now, once this thing connects, my network might be a little bit screwed up from OBS. But something that I could immediately type in is hi. Let's see, it could be let's see if Palfun will respond. Palfun just streamed right now. So you can see that the hi was successful. And this is probably because him and I have established a DM already. We've already connected ships. And this is effectively the equivalent of pinging someone. So I'm saying, hey, yo, remote computer over there, I exist. Do you sort of recognize that I exist? And in this case, yes, we both recognize that one another is in fact alive and on the network. I think if I were to go here and try to hi a sort of classically unavailable ship, I think it's in RAM. It might be Ramnes. If I try to hi this classically unavailable ship, you see here that this thing is not responding to me right now. Everyone knows that this star is offline, and it'll probably just continue to signal to me, hey, I'm not responding yet, but we'll keep trying, for an indefinite or like a long period of time. So this goes to show that, point-to-point connection is possible, and really what we could begin to imagine is a way of doing that on the interface side, where it's like rather than navigating to a group, maybe what I can perform in the near future is a means of saying directly to Palfun, like, hey, what's up? What are you making available for me to know about you? And having that information be displayed in kind. So hopefully that's a decent answer, or a decent enough answer, or at least an evoking of what an answer could possibly be in the near future. And you can see here that other things are sort of filing in. So it looks like every once in a while connections will drop momentarily, come back in. This is just the expected dynamic of using a peer-to-peer computer. So unless there's any other questions, I will continue to play chill, fun music. Let's see, not right now. Bandcamp. And this is where I was sourcing some music from, by the way. It was pretty good. Any other questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. I'll be hanging out for approximately 10 or so more minutes up until the top of the hour, when I think Galen will be doing his own streaming. I think he'll be interviewing one of the team members that work here at Tlon. So stay tuned for that. Oh, cool. I just received another question, and it looks like we have 8 minutes left. Let me lower my volume in case no one heard that. Oh, that's my voice. All right, lowering the volume. This should be good enough. All right, let me read off this question. Hey, Ed, how do you, quote, the landscape team, prioritize user stories and so in the near infinite space, given the wild open problem set? Oh, God, that is the question. That is one of the harder questions I think that we sort of encounter in the day-to-day. Actually, I should probably lower the music on my side so I can hear myself think. Where's the volume? I forget how volume is managed on Bandcamp. Oops. Oh well, it's fine. All right. I think that the best way to sort of frame this is that we try to sort of very proactively, at least in Landscape's case, for more near-term work. I think a lot of maybe our more speculative or R&D work kind of wants to sort of tackle that near infinite possibility head-on and really stretch what is currently possible with social interfaces. But given Landscape right now, this kind of highly utilitarian thing, the way that I've been explaining it to a lot of people who ask me, what is this thing? What is the software? Why is it interesting? Is that it could be explicitly called an application or a platform for assembling communities. And I think that this is kind of a serious thing to just sort of take and sort of maybe deconstruct a little bit, because when I look at something like Discord or Slack or any sort of like very popular like communication platform out there, they really do orient around communication. Like their thing is kind of providing communicative methods for you to sort of like interact with other people. Obviously, communication is at the heart of a lot of how people sort of interact with one another. But I think that one of the things that we are sort of thinking quite seriously about is how do you sort of define the environment that is the community, or the sort of like the bounds of what a community is able to actually do or participate in or conceive of itself within. So, you have here this idea that I think what we are doing in terms of just user stories or even sort of bounding what it will be possible in this thing is kind of approaching this from almost an approach that you could say is derived from how people who design video games think about how they define environments or worlds within the context of these virtual environments. I think that we kind of throw around the word world building in a lot of the work that we do, in the sense that we don't really think of Landscape, in our ideal sort of penning of what this thing is. We don't think of it as like a chat app, or we don't think of it as a streaming app. We think of it as an environment that can take on these capabilities for people to basically assemble a space that they can really use for whatever purposes they deem fit. You can imagine a world where Landscape does support streaming, live streaming with like a key and OBS and everything, but rather than using it for doing what I'm doing now, you can imagine a community linking that into a library of like torrents, and it could be like a community theater, or it could be you could set up a camera on your rooftop and sort of watch the waves if you're near the beach, and it could be like a community that is sort of oriented around surfing and knowing where to surf. That could be their sort of mechanism of being able to tune into how the waves are doing through that group. And so I think what we're less interested in exploring, not that we're taking it less seriously, is that sort of like baseline functionality, which could be arbitrary. People could develop their own modules, their own sets of functionality, their own types of channels. And it's really, how do you begin to assemble these things into a legible form for a community to use? And I've been personally finding a lot of my own sort of research here that like a lot of the way that video games are structured and how they're talked about with respect to mechanics, and how it is mechanically possible for you to do X, Y, and Z, but not A, B, and C, is super important in this work that we're doing. I think that some of the work that I have seen, which is really inspiring and has sort of inspired a lot of the way that we think about these things, at least for me, just speaking from my own experience, is some of the work that the team at Quora was working on for a while, which was kind of a general Q&A application platform or website. And I think a lot of the writing that had emerged from that team, which was headed by David Cole at the time, really talked about this notion of mechanics and interface mechanics, and how this is like a very serious realm of inquiry for anyone who's interested in developing places that people inhabit, not just websites or applications or digital things, products. These are places that you inhabit. They are sort of simultaneously spaces and bodies in a way. Just seeing if I have time. Yeah, to get into that sort of bodies metaphor, I actually will turn down the sound so I can hear myself. Or actually, I'll just turn it off, screw it. So like, just to get into that a little bit more, I think one of the sort of examples that I've been sort of really using to sort of quickly describe what I'm talking about is this idea that when you use something like Twitter, people sort of talk about this thing as though it's sort of like this environment where you can do a lot of things, but you really can't do that much. You're almost in a straitjacket with respect to what is possible in sort of the Twitter space. You can kind of like look ahead. Your head is kind of locked in a sort of unidirectional direction that the feed takes on. You can only look at things per the algorithm sort of determination, and you can only reblog, you can like, and whatever else you can do with tweets. It's very clear, I think, for someone who is, I think, thinking of interfaces as extensions of the body or as extensions of capability, that you are in a straitjacket. You're not in like a place. You're not in sort of a free-form environment when you are using Twitter. And I feel like a lot of people, when they approach the design of digital things, they kind of take this as a given. It's like, oh, of course, this is how applications should work. This is how networks should work. This is the type of constraint that we think is appropriate and normal. When you zoom out, it's like with the broader possibility of what is possible with computers, and you can do anything with computers. It's insane that I can't, draw Boolean draw circles around like my group of people that I follow on Twitter and Boolean union them arbitrarily and view different branches of tweets, or view tweets as maybe more expressionistic things. I hope that someday this is possible with the way that we are building landscape. It's kind of like more of an innate, like kind of personal desire, but I think it's something that, it could be worth thinking about, I think, when it comes to the design of these new interfaces. Whether Tlon ends up doing it or another entity ends up building a client that is possible of thinking about interfaces these days, I think that's really important for the development of social kind of community assembling interfaces. So that was a bit of I kind of like went off into the weeds, but I hope that was an interesting or useful answer. And with that, that is the sort of top of the hour. And yeah, thanks for all the questions. Thanks for sticking around. I'm going to have to end this quite abruptly just to make sure that this doesn't overlap with Galen's stream mechanically. I'm actually unsure if YouTube can handle an overlap, but it was nice hanging out. Bye, everyone.